Faith can still be growing even when it stops looking the way that you might expect or the way that you think it should look. And for a lot of Christian parents, that's hard to see in real time because when a familiar spiritual habit changes, it's easy to panic. It's easy to assume something important is fading. It's easy to confuse a change in form with a loss of substance. Hi, I'm Dan Hayden, and this is the Positive Legacy Podcast for Christian Fathers. This episode is titled When Your Teen's Faith Doesn't Look Like It Used to. If you're parenting teenagers or heading that direction, I think this is one of the most important things to understand. Your child's faith was never meant to stay frozen in its childhood form. Can you imagine that? Probably not where we want our kids' faith to be, the same it was when they were 6. That doesn't necessarily mean, hey, anything goes. It doesn't mean that discernment no longer matters or doesn't matter at all. And it doesn't mean that there won't be hard lessons and hard questions that you're going to have to answer or real concerns that you'll have as well. It just means that as kids grow, faith often starts expressing itself differently and in many different forms, many different ways. And if we don't recognize that, we can end up reacting to the wrong thing. A couple of years ago, my wife was pretty concerned about our daughter's prayer life. More specifically, she was concerned that they weren't really praying at dinner time anymore. At our dinner table, everybody pauses and says a prayer. Well, for our teenagers, that stopped a while back. And as a Christian parent, I totally get that concern. But when a once visible spiritual rhythm starts changing, it can stir up a lot of fear sometimes. Maybe you start wondering to yourself, are they drifting from the faith? And by the way, drifting is a normal thing. You start wondering, are they maybe they're disengaging? Is their faith weakening? Am I doing something wrong? Are we missing something important here? Those are real questions. But here's what's also true at the same time. Our daughters were still going to church. They were still very actively engaged in student ministry on Wednesday nights. That is an absolute, must show up. They have to show up. They have to experience that every Wednesday night. That's their decision. They were inviting their friends to youth group. They were comfortable enough in their faith to welcome other people into it. And when they had questions or reservations, they were often working those out with their trusted small group leaders. All of that matters because their actions were speaking far more loudly than their lack of dinner table words ever could. In other words, their faith hadn't disappeared. It was just not showing up in the exact form that it once had. And I think a lot of dads need help making that distinction. That's one of the reasons I spend so much time coaching fathers through discernment, because many of us are quick to notice what has changed, but slower to notice what is still alive. We can become so attached to one form of spiritual expression that we miss the deeper evidence of real faith growing underneath it. So let's stay there for a minute. One of the mistakes we often make as parents is assuming that our preferred style of connecting with God is the standard everyone else in our family should just naturally follow. If prayer at the dinner table moves you, you may assume that one of the clearest signs of spiritual health. If worship music deeply affects you, you may assume visible engagement in singing is the marker. If Bible study and discussion are your thing, you may assume that verbal processing is where real growth starts to show up. But as you know, or maybe you don't, that's okay. People connect with God differently. Some people are deeply moved in worship. Some are most alive when they're in prayer. Some open up in small group discussion. Some connect mostly through service. Some connect through quiet reflection. Or maybe it's one-on-one conversation. Or maybe it's just reading and studying the scripture in solitude. That variety doesn't automatically signal inconsistency. Sometimes it signals design. Your teenager may not express the same express faith the same way that you do, and they may not express it the same way they did when they were 9. That does not automatically mean something is wrong or they're drifting or they're disengaging. Now, of course, this is where discernment matters the most. I'm not saying, well, everybody's different, so never pay attention. That's not what I want you to hear me say. What I am saying is the better question to ask is not necessarily, are they doing faith the way I expect? But rather, how is faith actually showing up in them right now? That's a much wiser question and a little more nuanced. In our house, if I had only looked at one changed practice, I could have told myself a story of decline. But when I widen the lens with the help of our youth pastor, to be honest with you, I saw something else entirely. I saw teenagers who were still growing up, still leaning in, still bringing friends who were then bringing their own parents. I saw teenagers who were still identifying with their faith publicly. In one case, she even made her own sweatshirt that said on the back, Jesus loves you. That's not the sign of someone who's disengaging with their faith. I saw teenagers who are still willing to be a part of a spiritual community. Again, that's not dead faith. That's faith taking root in a more personal way. And that's important because teenage faith often becomes less performative and more chosen. When kids are younger, a lot of their spiritual life is shaped by your rhythms as their parents. You pray before meals, you bring them to church, you ask the questions, and you create and nurture that environment. And that's totally appropriate. But as they mature, some of those practices stop feeling automatic and they can be unsettling to parents because visible compliance starts giving way to personal ownership. And ownership is messier, it's less scripted, it's less cute, and it's far less predictable. But often it is more real. That's one of the big themes I'd want you to hear in this episode is sometimes teenage faith is not getting smaller. It's getting less externally managed and more internally owned. That shift can look quieter in some places while getting stronger in others. And if you can recognize that, you parent with a lot more peace. You parent with a lot more curiosity. This is also where I think dads need to watch their impulse to interpret one symptom. One change to a rhythm, one changed rhythm does not tell the whole story. One awkward answer does not tell the whole story. And certainly, one phase of disengagement in one expression, such as dinner time prayer, does not tell the whole story. What tells the story is the larger pattern of where their heart is leaning. Are they still open to spiritual community? Are they still willing to identify with faith? Are they still asking real questions somewhere? It doesn't necessarily have to be, with you in a car ride or at the dinner table. As long as they have an outlet and they have someone that they trust that they can ask those questions to, that's awesome. You know, uh, are they still willing to bring others into their world, into their faith world with them? Are they still responsive to God in any recognizable way? Those are better questions. And honestly, this is the one of the places where coaching can be really helpful for dads because when faith touches your kids, it touches some of the deepest parts of your heart. It's very easy to react emotionally and start drawing conclusions too quickly. Sometimes you need help just stepping back and asking, what is actually happening here? And what am I merely afraid is happening? That's what coaching can provide you perspective, and that's a big difference. But uh, I also think this matters because spiritual style is often tied to temperament. One kid may love praying out loud and another may hate being put on the spot, but still pray deeply in private. One may connect through worship night and music. One may feel closest to God through conversation or service. One may take her eye black from a softball game and paint crosses on her face. One may thrive with a small group leader who asks really good questions. And another may process internally and bring things up later, maybe one on one. That doesn't mean every style is equally mature in every moment, but it does mean faithfulness does not always wear the same face. As a dad, part of your job is not just to pass on faith, but to learn how your kid tends to receive and express it. That's much more relational approach than simply measuring whether they are checking the same boxes that you would check. And that's one of the things I help dads work through in coaching too. Not just how do I get my kids to do spiritual things, but rather, how do I become wise enough to recognize how God may actually be working in my kid, even when it doesn't look like my script? That kind of discernment changes the whole tone of your parenting. Instead of reacting with fear, you start responding with curiosity. Instead of, hey, how come you're not praying like you used to? It becomes, how has faith been feeling for you lately? Instead of, you never say anything spiritual at dinner anymore. It becomes, where do you feel closest to God these days? That's another practice that we started to institute. Once our daughters sort of drew back for our normal nighttime dinner time prayer, now they have the option of having one expression of gratitude, from their day. Also, instead of asking something like or stating something like, I'm worried because you're not doing this one thing, whatever that one thing may be, it becomes, what helps you connect with God in a way that feels right? Those are two very different, those are many different conversations, and they create space for honesty. That matters because if your teen feels like the only acceptable version of faith is your preferred vision, they may start performing instead of telling the truth. And performed faith is pretty fragile. As someone who grew up Catholic, I can absolutely attest to that. And this is not an indictment on my upbringing. But at one point in time, it simply became the practice of a religion than the sort of growth in my faith. And what we want, though, right, is honest faith. And we want that growth and we want it owned. And so later in life, I was finally able to own that faith. Now, I also want to say something about small group leaders in a spiritual community, because in our case, that has been incredibly vital and very important for the spiritual growth and development of our kids. And especially as I start to step into a role as a small group leader at my church as well. There can be a temptation as a parent to feel threatened if your child is more willing to process spiritual questions with another trusted adult than directly with you. I don't think that has to be threatening. In fact, I will tell you it's not. I specifically chose to take a group of young boys and grow with them over the next 3 to 7 years. And my son is not in that group. I specifically chose it. I want to provide him another outlet other than me to have these hard questions. I want another man in his life, and that's okay. Uh, all of this should and ought to be seen as a gift rather than a threat. If your teen has safe, mature, spiritually grounded leaders that they trust, that is something to be grateful for. It doesn't replace you. You're still their dad, but it strengthens the ecosystem around your kid. Your role as a dad is still very much irreplaceable, but you were never meant to be the only voice in the lives of your kids. And if your child trusts a small group leader enough to bring real questions there, that's often a sign that faith still matters to them. They're not ignoring it. They're engaging it in a place that feels safe and appropriate for this season. And that's good news. As a dad, you can bless that instead of compete with it. You can say, I'm really glad you have leaders that you trust. You can ask them, what's been standing out to you there lately? You can stay interested and curious without forcing yourself into every spiritual conversation. That kind of posture keeps you connected without becoming controlling. And that's a phrase I'd come back to again and again in parenting teenagers: connecting, not controlling. Sometimes the most powerful spiritual leadership that you can offer is not more pressure. It's steady interest and curiosity, a calm presence with real integrity. And of course, enough humility to admit that God may be working in your kid in ways you do not immediately recognize. That doesn't mean you stop paying attention. It just means you pay attention just a little better. So, what do you look for here? I'll start right here. Look for what they move toward willingly. Look for where they show courage and how they talk about people and purpose and truth and belonging. Look for whether they invite others into their faith world. That was a key. Remember, that was a key indicator for me and my wife. Look for whether they seem comfortable being publicly associated with Jesus and the church. And look for whether they seek out trusted spiritual voices. Those things matter. In our case, the fact that our daughters were bringing friends to church and into student ministry told us a lot. It told us they were not ashamed of their faith. It told us they were not merely tolerating church as something imposed from the outside. It told me they were comfortable enough in that environment to invite others in. And that is no small thing. That is a real sign of strong spiritual health. And I think a lot of parents need permission to recognize these kind of indicators, especially when a more familiar or traditional practice has faded a bit. This is also where it helps to distinguish between symbolic concern and substantive concern. Symbolic concern says, this one visible habit changed, so I'm alarmed. Substantive concern asks, is the deeper life of faith actually diminishing, or is it being expressed differently now? That's a much stronger question. And frankly, that's a great place to bring into coaching if you ever feel stuck. Because so many dads don't need more panic. They need a clearer sight. They need someone to help them discern the difference between a changed form and a weakened foundation. So let me make this practical. If you've been worried about your kid's spiritual life lately, I want you to try this exercise. Instead of making a list of what has changed or what feels missing, make 2 columns. In the first column, write what no longer looks the same. Maybe they don't pray out loud the way they used to. Maybe they're less expressive in family spiritual moments. Maybe they don't answer your questions the same way they did when they were younger. Then the second column, where do I see evidence of real faith? Again, maybe they're still very much tied and committed to their Wednesday night youth group. Maybe they're still inviting friends. Maybe they still care about things like justice and kindness and truth. Maybe they're posting Christian faith-based messages on their social media. Maybe they're asking thoughtful questions. Maybe they still pray, just not in the same setting or style that you expected. That exercise can be incredibly clarifying. It shifts you out of tunnel vision and helps you see the fuller picture. And if you do realize there are real concerns, you'll be approaching them with better discernment, not just raw fear. I think that's one of the most important things a father can do is learn to read his child's spiritual life with wisdom instead of panic. So here's your challenge for this week. Don't force a deeper conversation right away. In fact, don't force a deeper conversation in any way. Instead, take 2 quiet minutes and ask yourself, what form of spiritual expression have I been most focused on? What might I be overlooking because it doesn't look like my preferred style? And lastly, where do I see signs of faith and courage and ownership in my child right now? And if the opportunity opens naturally, ask curious questions. What part of church or youth group feels most meaningful to you these days? Do you feel closer to God in worship, in conversation, in prayer, or somewhere else? Who are the people helping your faith feel real right now? And guess what? I just want you to listen. Just listen to what they have to say. And don't correct the style right away. Don't rush to measure it. See what's actually there. As always, if this episode is resonating with you, especially if you've been carrying concern or confusion or even some guilt about your kids' spiritual lives, I want to invite you to take the next step. This is one of the places where good dads can quietly carry a lot of anxiety. You want to lead well. You want to see real faith in your children, but sometimes you need help discerning what's actually happening and how to respond wisely. Inside my Positive Legacy Academy, this is the kind of thing we walk through together. How to read your child's spiritual life with more discernment. How to lead without overreacting. How to recognize real signs of growth. How to stay connected when forms begin to change. And how to keep your own walk with God steady in the middle of all of this uncertainty. If that sounds like where you are, I'd love to invite you to a complimentary coaching call. On that call, We'll talk about what's been concerning you about your kid's spiritual life, what signs you may be missing, how you want to show up as a father in this season. You can grab a time through the link in the show notes if you're interested. Faith maturing in your teenagers and in your kids may not always look like it used to. That does not automatically mean it's fading. As you think about your child this week, where might God already be at work in ways that look different than you expected? Until next time, and as always, stay rooted in grace, stay steady in mind and spirit, and keep building your positive legacy one small intentional moment at a time. Talk again next week.